Hello, and thank you for joining the Semperis Live webinar today, where we're discussing a very important topic in the heels of the new released Windows Server 2016. We are going to discuss with you how it affects your Active Directory and what you could do to better prepare for these changes. On the line today, we're very happy to have Brian Desmond, who is a principal consultant with Ravenswood Technology Group. Brian works with enterprise customers on issues around Active Directory, security, and identity management. He is also the author of O'Reilly's Active Directory book and a Microsoft MVP for Identity and Access Management. On the line, we also have Mickey Bresman, who is the CEO and co-founder of Semperis. Mickey has nearly 2 decades of enterprise software experience, stretching back from his management roles in the Navy Computing Technical Unit to his days as a CTO of a Microsoft Gold Partner integration company. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started with the presentation. Today's session is being recorded, so if you feel you want to review parts of the presentation or share it with your colleagues, we will be in touch in just a few days providing the recording link. Also, our panelists will take live questions and answers during the end of this session. So if you have any questions come up during the presentation, please feel free to send us your questions using the webinar question tool. We will collect them and answer them all at the end. With that, I will pass it on to Mickey to start the description of Semperis.
Thank you, Metal. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Mickey, and I'm the CEO of Semperis. Semperis is an identity and access management provider for hybrid IT environments. Our technology focuses on 2 key solutions: a full forest recovery solution based on a simple restoration wizard where we were able to simplify the recovery process to 3 simple steps, fully automating the Active Directory disaster recovery process, the Semperis ADFR, and the Semperis Active Directory State Manager that constantly tracks all of the Active Directory modifications, storing them in an SQL database, which provides a fast and simple comparison of different Active Directory states with rich queries and restoration mechanism. I would like to remind you that this webinar recording will be uploaded to the Semperis website, where you can find the previous webinars recordings and sign up for the next month webinar on the topic of Active Directory disaster recovery best practices. And with that, I'm going to transfer it to Brian.
All right, well, thanks for that introduction, Mickey. And like Mickey said, my name is Brian Desmond. I'm going to be talking for the next remainder of this slot about what's new in Windows Server 2016 as it relates to Active Directory. And specifically when we say Active Directory, kind of that term has evolved a fair bit over the past time that AD has been about. So we'll spend some time talking about AD domain services, that what you think of traditionally as Active Directory. Then we're also going to spend some time talking about Active Directory Federation services, because in today's kind of cloud-centric or certainly very hybrid environment, ADFS, Active Directory Federation Service, is a key part of Microsoft's identity strategy there, and obviously part of the Active Directory umbrella as well. So just kicking off with what's new in AD domain services, want to talk a little bit about, before we even talk about what's new, how did we get to where we are today? You know, AD has been around for almost 20 years now. Windows 2000 came out in 1999, and if you were working with this back then, you might have even worked with this before it was even Active Directory and before it was Windows 2000. But the important thing here is that over the past 16, 17, 18 years, AD has matured tremendously, and now it's really a stable product. It's not necessarily something that you're seeing Microsoft spend a great deal of time and energy putting interesting new features in and new capabilities compared to when we looked at certainly Windows 2003 and 2008 and 2008 R2, which really had significant iteration and innovation for AD as a product. Instead, what we're seeing is Microsoft's really investing around AD as it's a key foundation for identity in almost every enterprise, and certainly it's a key foundation for Microsoft's hybrid identity model that they have with uh, with Azure Active Directory, but where they are investing is around security, and almost everything we're going to talk about today is really focused on security. It's getting so much traction in the news, and AD is the place to start for many attacks. So we'll see a lot of investment around security, and of course a lot of investment about what it takes to be able to have that hybrid identity model, that bridge to the cloud. All right. So on that note, one of the first features I want to talk about is this concept of time-limited links. And just to set the stage, this might not seem too interesting on its own, but this is going to build into a much broader set of capabilities that we're going to talk about in a minute. And when I talk about links, I'm talking about what Active Directory calls linked values. Fundamentally, links in AD, if you're familiar with traditional databases, are like a primary key foreign key relationship. And the really most common example of when a link is used in AD is group membership. Rather than actually storing on the group a list of the individual users or computers that are members of that group, instead AD stores those are what are called linked values. And in the linked value, it has pointers to the actual user that's a member of the group, or a computer that's a member of the group, and so forth. So as things change on the user or the computer, nothing has to change on the group. It just has a pointer to that object. Other things like your manager and direct reports relationship, or an assistant and all the executives that they help, those are all examples of linked values in AD. And historically, as soon as you add someone to a group, they're in that group till you take administrative action to remove them. The new change in Windows Server 2016 Active Directory for linked values is that when you create a linked value, you can now put a time limit on the value of that link. So you can say that when I add someone to a group membership, their group membership expires in 8 hours. And when that expiry time comes, AD will automatically come along and it'll clean up that link. Now, this is really interesting because in a minute we're going to talk about some privileged access constructs and being able to give temporary administrative access, and this feature is fundamental to how that works. Under the covers inside of Kerberos in particular, these time-limited group memberships get honored when you get things like your TGT, your ticket granting ticket. That TGT is what you use once you've logged in and AD's authenticated you. You use that TGT to go get access to other resources in the form of service tickets. Now, by default, TGTs are good for 10 hours. What that means is once you log in, if you have that TGT for a period of 10 hours, you don't necessarily need to re-authenticate to get access to other resources. But in that TGT is also some important data about what groups you're a member of, amongst other things. Now, because we potentially have group memberships that could expire a lot sooner than 10 hours, maybe they expire in an hour, maybe they expire in 2 days, the maximum lifetime of your TGT is going to be the shortest group membership lifetime. So if you're in a 4-hour group, you're never going to be able to get a TGT that's valid for more than 4 hours. And along the same line, service tickets, which is what Kerberos gives you when you want to go access a resource like a file share or an internal website, are also going to honor those group membership time to lives. And the same thing with if the resource, what you're accessing on the other end, the file server, for example, is a member of a group with a lifetime on it, that'll be honored too. So no longer do we have TGTs and service tickets that are good for a default static amount of time. Instead, this is going to vary based on your group membership. Now, one key thing to know here, in order to use this feature, you do have to be at the Windows Server 2016 forest functional level. So that means all the domain controllers in your forest have to be running Windows Server 2016. And you might be thinking, just hearing that, well, it's going to take me forever to be able to use this. We'll see in a minute the key feature that uses this capability, these time-limited links, actually typically requires standing up a new forest. So it's not quite as bad as it might sound. Now, that special feature that really takes advantage of time-limited links is this new concept of having a privileged access forest. And just to give you a little bit of background, when I talk about privileged access, a really common example is people that are in domain admins or another sensitive group in AD. It gives you access to a lot of resources and the ability to really traverse the environment. Those privileged identities, they're a key target for attackers that are going after Active Directory, those bad guys that are trying to get into your environment. And once they're in your environment, these privileged identities are the first thing they're going to try and get their hands on. And we talked about how AD's been around for a really long time. It's been around for some organizations for almost 20 years, if they put it in right when Windows 2000 came out. And over time, the security recommendations for AD have evolved substantially. And of course, with those recommendations, customers and organizations need to evolve their security posture to meet that. But above all, it's really hard to know today, especially in a large organization, with a really high level of assurance that nothing bad's happened in your Active Directory forest. I'm not talking about from an operational perspective. It's operationally more than likely quite healthy. But what about, has a bad guy been in there? Is there an attacker that's has a persistent capability in your environment that you don't even know about? And because of that, it's really hard to say that those privileged identities are all safe and sound. So the approach here is that we stand up a totally new forest that has these privileged identities in it, and we lock it down from day one and make sure it's built to only the highest standards and all the current best practices. And we transition our privileged accounts out of our production AD forest, which might have some issues. It's possible it's been compromised and we don't even know it, into this brand new forest that's secure and locked down, and we know to be in a really good state. What we do then, so that you can continue to use these privileged identities, is we establish a special kind of trust between the new forests. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the important thing here, why did I just tell you about these time-limited links, is that now what we can do is we can take our elevated groups, our domain admins, for example, and we can say that, you know what, when I need to be a domain admin, I have to request that, and I get it approved, and I can only be in that group for a period of 4 hours at a time. And AD will actually enforce that 4-hour group membership limit through the use of those time-limited links. So that's where the tie-in comes together. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. The actual inserting a member into a group with a TTL, that time to live, is done via LDAP. So any tool that can talk LDAP to AD can go ahead and take advantage of that. MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager, Microsoft's on-premises identity and access management toolset, has a UI for this, has a set of workflows that let you do things like do approvals to get into these privileged roles. You can do multi-factor authentication, and you can have MIM elevate your privileged account on the fly. That's not to say that you need MIM for this, but that's Microsoft's solution to provide an end-to-end UI around this. If you use another privileged access tool set like a CyberArk, for example, or any number of other tools that compete in that space, more than likely, if they don't already support these capabilities, they'll probably be taking advantage of them soon. Now, you're probably wondering, how exactly does this work? I alluded to this a little bit as we were talking about what it is, but what we do, we build that Windows Server 2016 forest, we lock it down to all our best practices, and that's going to be the place where we put our privileged identities. We create a special kind of trust, and that trust is going to be between your production forest, which doesn't have to be Windows Server 2016. It simply needs to be on a supported version, and it needs to be patched relatively recently. And we create a trust, this privileged identity trust as we'll call it, with the new Bastion forest, that Windows Server 2016 forest. And over that trust is how users or how administrators are going to take advantage of their privileged identity. There's also a new type of object that's in the AD schema in Windows Server 2016, and this is something that we'll create in our Secure and our Bastion forest, and they're called shadow groups. And shadow groups aren't exactly groups per se, but what they allow us to do is take the SID of a group in our production forest. The SID is that security identifier. It starts with like S-1-5 and a whole bunch of numbers after it. And when you get added to a shadow group, your token, your logon token that gets computed by the privileged access forest, also includes the SIDs of the privileged groups in the production forest. So now the only way to get those into your token is by using one of these shadow groups that you're added to in the privileged access forest. When you're added to those shadow groups, you use those time-limited group memberships. So based on the policies you define, the tools that you take advantage of, or the tools that you use, that's how long you're actually in that shadow group. Maybe domain admins, I can only be in there for 4 hours. So when I'm added to that group, AD will automatically take me out after 4 hours. And because of the Kerberos enhancements that we talked about when we talked about time-limited groups, at the end of that 4-hour period, my TGT, my ticket granting ticket, expires, and I can no longer use it until I renew my access or get added back into the shadow group. All right, so just to summarize, we take these time-limited links that say how long I can have a linked attribute value in AD, a group membership being a really good example of that. We have this new privileged access forest with these things called shadow groups that have the SIDs of groups in our production forest, sensitive groups. And because my identity is in this secure lockdown forest, By default, I can't use it for anything until I'm added to a shadow group on a temporary basis, and then I get the ability to log on and take advantage of those groups. So a really important security feature, and really something that all the customers that I'm talking to, I suggest they look pretty strongly at how do they go about adding this to their environment and really stepping up the level of assurance around their privileged identities, which tend to be one of the top targets as people are looking to compromise the environment. So switching gears a little bit to another really key feature, key capability around Active Directory is, as organizations have looked to virtualize most of their infrastructure, if not all of their infrastructure, there's been a new set of potential vulnerabilities, potential challenges that have been introduced actually by that virtualization process. Previously, if we had physical hardware, and just taking AD as a good example, we ran domain controllers on that physical hardware. Physical access to the server that it was running on was actually a fairly key control in terms of securing those domain controllers. But as we move to virtualize that, now where that domain controller runs, where that virtual machine runs, and the underlying storage, in the case of Hyper-V like a VHD file, where that lives can be in any number of locations. And now all the people that have access to the hypervisor, whether that's Hyper-V or VMware or another competing solution, they have full access to the underlying storage, to the underlying virtual machine. And while they might not be domain admins, starting with one of those people, compromising one of those identities, it wouldn't be out of the picture to be able to elevate yourself to the point that you could take control of the domain controllers in the environment. So this is a key risk. It's something to think about as you virtualize domain controllers. Do I trust the organization or the teams that actually have access to the virtualization hosts? And otherwise, there's things that could happen. The actual virtual disk file that has the data for the domain controller, it could be stolen. Someone could copy it off the SAN or off the machine that's storing it. It could be tampered with, and things could be introduced back into the environment. And either way, that could expose not the entire forest. If you think about being able to take a virtual hard disk file away, now I have all the password hashes that are stored on that virtual disk, and that's a point that I could use to start trying to compromise one of those accounts and taking advantage of it. If you go back maybe almost 10 years ago to Windows Server 2008, when read-only domain controllers were in the works, this was a key risk that they were trying to mitigate with RODCs, because when you had physical domain controllers in locations where you couldn't guarantee physical security, if someone actually stole one of those domain controllers or stole one of the hard disk drives, they could potentially compromise the entire AD database. That same effect applies when you can get a hold of the virtual disk file, which is way more portable than a traditional physical server. And along the same lines, anyone that has administrative access to that hypervisor, to that Hyper-V machine, they have a certain level of kind of implied access to the guest virtual machines, the guest workloads. Even if they're not domain admins, the steps they have to take to get there are a lot less than someone that's starting with no access to the hypervisor. So both of those things in mind, in Hyper-V and Windows Server 2016, there's a couple of really interesting new capabilities called guarded fabrics and shielded virtual machines. And you can think of the fabric as the kind of conglomeration, if you will, of all the different Hyper-V hosts that are hosting your environment. And then shielded virtual machines are a special set of protections applied to the individual virtual machines that run on the fabric. Now, just fair warning, this feature on its own, we could easily fill well over an hour talking about how it works. So we're just going to talk in fairly high level what it does, how it works, and how it's relevant to you as you think about Active Directory if you have that workload virtualized. So at a high level, what constitutes a shielded virtual machine? The key thing is when you have encrypted virtual machines, they can now encrypt the contents of the VHD using BitLocker. And of course, you couldn't do that before really within a virtual machine because BitLocker requires some place to put the key. And on a physical machine, uses what's called the TPM, or the Trusted Platform Module. Now, with the shielded virtual machines capability, Hyper-V is actually able to project a TPM into the virtual machine, which makes it think that it has that hardware TPM and a place to put the keys, which means it can encrypt the drive. Now, in order to actually decrypt that virtual machine and run it, the Hyper-V host, it has to be approved and healthy within the fabric. And the way this is all tracked, the way those keys are taken care of, is there's a new thing called the Host Guardian service. And it's a completely separate component that all your Hyper-V hosts that are running shielded virtual machines are going to depend on to be able to start those workloads and access them. And that Host Guardian service, typically it's recommended that it runs on a separate cluster of machines. Microsoft actually recommends a cluster of at least 3 machines to take care of this. And amongst other things, it's responsible for 2 really important tasks, at least in the case of our discussion here. One, it takes care of validating that the Hyper-V hosts are actually healthy. And that healthy state is what's going to make sure that it's a secure and a good place that you actually run these shielded VMs, perhaps in your case, or the case of what we're discussing, domain controllers. And once those Hyper-V hosts seem to be healthy, they meet all the prerequisites, that Host Guardian service actually issues the set of keys that the Hyper-V host uses to start that shielded virtual machine, to be able to actually decrypt the workload and run it. So by doing this, it completely isolates the people that have access to the Hyper-V fabric from the ability to get into the contents of a virtual hard disk file, or through when you take advantage of all the shielding capabilities, not just the encryption. It effectively completely isolates that virtual machine from the Hyper-V administrator themselves. That means they can't do things like even connect to the remote console, or connect to something like a virtual serial port and try to get access to that virtual machine as if they were getting access to physical hardware itself. So for really important and sensitive workloads, domain controllers being a really good example of those, running them on a guarded fabric with shielded virtual machines provides you an immense amount of security that before you didn't have, without really running your own fabric, your own set of Hyper-V hosts dedicated just to domain controllers. And except for really the largest customers, the environments where those economies of scale still exist to run dedicated virtualization just for AD, the cost to do that before was really high relative to the benefits. With this guarded fabric with shielded virtual machines, you get those capabilities while you're still on a shared set of infrastructure and a shared set of hosts. Now, another security thing that just keeps coming up as topics go is how insecure passwords are today. Even if you look at consumer properties that you use, maybe your bank, for example, or other websites you visit, two-factor authentication has become really common, not just in the enterprise, but really everywhere you look. Because passwords today, they're just not what they used to be made out to be. And for Windows 10, Microsoft came out with these capabilities called Windows Hello for Business. And what it lets people do is use a key that's specific to that machine to authenticate to resources via Active Directory, and with Azure Active Directory as well, without actually using their password. And at a super high level, the way this works is that you have a specific key or certificate that's stored in that TPM, that trusted platform module that's on your device, your laptop or your desktop. And to unlock that, rather than using a password, use some sort of a device-specific gesture. Gesture is kind of the word that Microsoft is using in all the documentation, but that gesture could be a PIN, or it could be a biometric, like a face print if you have a compatible camera, or a fingerprint if you have a fingerprint reader. And maybe the first thing you're saying is, well, now I sign in to my device with a PIN. How could that possibly be more secure than my password? And the important thing here is that that PIN is specific only to unlocking the TPM, to unlocking the key that's on that specific device, and then the actual authentication happens with the key or certificate itself. So rather than a password that you can use anywhere, now you have a PIN or a biometric gesture that only works on that single device. So it takes passwords completely out of the equation and still gives you that same domain-based logon experience that everybody's been used to for practically forever. There's 2 ways you can do this. If you have Windows Server 2016 domain controllers in your environment, you don't have to be completely at Windows Server 2016, but you have to have enough of them that they can support the authentication loads from Windows Hello clients, Windows Hello for Business clients. They can do what are called key-based logons. If you have earlier versions of Windows Server, and you have a PKI infrastructure with certificate authorities and so forth, and today one other requirement is you need SCCM, System Center Configuration Manager. You can actually enroll all your devices to get special logon certificates that are stored on those devices. And when you do one of those gestures, whether it's a PIN or a biometric like your face or a fingerprint, it can unlock that certificate, and that certificate can be used to log on to the domain. Again, completely without passwords. One other thing that you need for this today is you do need to have Azure Active Directory in place. There's work underway to make it so that this can be a completely on-premises solution, but today you do need Azure AD for this. Overall, the key thing with Windows Hello for Business, this is making sure that you can sign into your device and sign into the domain without using your password in a much more secure manner. Another risk that that passwords and so forth really have created, and it's not just passwords actually, but as you look at a lot of different attacks, the way people look to move laterally within an environment in particular, is using things like pass the hash and pass the ticket attacks. And the way these start is that today, or I should say prior to Windows 10, when you sign in, the hash of your password for NTLM and the Kerberos tickets that you get from the domain controller as you sign in, they're all cached in memory. And with the right tools, you can get these tools for free on the internet if you do a little bit of digging around. You can actually extract those hashes or those Kerberos tickets from memory, and you can take them. You can go use them on another machine. So as soon as I have the TGT for a user, I get on their machine, I have elevated access, I pull that TGT out of memory because they're currently logged in, I can go be that user on any other machine in the network. And this is like the first step for really simple lateral movement across the environment, is being able to take these hashes and tickets and go use them. So to combat this effect where these tools could be created to actually go pull this data out of memory, with Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016, the LSAS process, the LSA, which is where all these secrets have always been stored in memory, has actually been split up so that part of it is actually virtualized on top of a thin hypervisor that's running on your machine. Of course, your machine needs to support the virtualization extensions and a number of other capabilities. But with modern hardware, this is pretty common, assuming it's all enabled in the firmware and so forth. And it actually takes those secrets, those NTLM hashes, those Kerberos tickets, and it puts them in this separate memory space that only a very select few binaries, select few files that are part of Windows can actually access there. There's certificate signing that goes on that makes sure that anything that's loaded into that memory is signed with a special certificate, so you can't just inject arbitrary code and go get at those hashes, go get at those tickets. This is a feature that's called Credential Guard in Windows 10. Definitely something that greatly enhances the security footprint. And one other thing it does is it does block some types of legacy credentials, less secure credentials, like NTLM v1, for example. With Credential Guard enabled, this is all blocked, and the user experience, that's seamless single sign-on, doesn't necessarily happen quite as seamlessly. But these are also types of credentials that you really don't want to be using. So again, this is a client-side feature called Credential Guard, and the goal of it is to make sure that being able to steal secrets from memory from a malicious user that might be trying to move laterally across the environment isn't as easy or even as possible as it is today prior to Windows 10. So on the same note, we talked a little bit about NTLM and how it's impacted with Credential Guard, but NTLM overall is kind of a black eye or a thorn that every environment has. Getting rid of it is a really challenging task, and for most large organizations, probably pretty close to impossible, at least with all the legacy applications and legacy devices and so forth that are out there. And over the past few releases of Windows, Microsoft's been trying to help with this. They started with controls to just simply limit what versions of NTLM you could use. That was simple enough. Of course, you still can't identify the devices that are actually using it. So then they added some capabilities where you could at least audit where NTLM is used. So then you had an idea of what rock you needed to look under to see what was going on. And then there were also controls that were added where you could simply turn off NTLM altogether. And chances are that unless you're in a really small environment or you have a really good handle on everything that's going on, using the big stick of simply turning it off is going to break things, and it's probably going to create unacceptable impact to the business. So that wasn't really practical for most organizations. So the latest iteration on that with Windows 2016 is being able to say where exactly NTLM can be used so that you can start filtering it down. You know there's certain locations where you have to use NTLM. There's no other option. Well, we can allow it there, but in locations where we know we don't have to use it, we can prevent it from being used instead. and so forth. So again, just more controls, more abilities to really control where you're using NTLM, provide more tools that you can use to start scaling it back within your environment. Now, the last kind of Active Directory domain services feature I want to talk about actually doesn't necessarily play into this theme of security. It's still a security feature, but not as much as everything else we've talked about. And in fact, this is actually a cloud feature called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. You'll sometimes see that abbreviated AADDS or AAD Domain Services. And the idea here is that as you look at all the applications that you run in your environment, especially if you're a large enterprise, you've got a whole set of applications that they're not going to support any sort of modern authentication protocol anytime soon. Federation is another way to look at that. You've got applications that simply don't support it, and either it's never going to be upgraded or the cost to upgrade that application to support Federation would just really be too costly. So as we look at these cloud scenarios where you want to move these to run on IaaS or in another type of cloud hosting environment, moving these legacy apps that don't support Federation into the cloud now means we have a dependency on our traditional Active Directory. Now, we just spent a bunch of time talking about securing domain controllers and the risks when they're virtualized. Of course, those risks go up even higher if you put those domain controllers into a public cloud environment where you don't necessarily even control the underlying disks or the fabric that they run on. So some organizations will accept those risks and others won't. But now you have these applications that require that you either have domain controllers running next to them in the IaaS environment. From a latency and availability perspective, that's probably the ideal scenario. Or you need to rely on your network connectivity, whether that's direct network connections in the case of Azure ExpressRoute, or things like site-to-site VPNs between the cloud and those on-premises data centers. So at that point, you're probably asking yourself, did I really get the benefit of putting this in the cloud if I still have these hard links to on-premises resources? So this is feedback, of course, that Microsoft's heard. They've been working on this feature called Azure AD Domain Services for a while. And what it does is it runs in Azure, it runs in the cloud, and it looks like Active Directory domain controllers. For all intents and purposes, as far as the application is concerned, when you turn on Azure AD Domain Services, you get two domain controllers, albeit with the name of a new domain and some changes there. But behind the scenes, it's actually using your Azure Active Directory as its data store. So you synchronize things from your Active Directory on premises to Azure Active Directory, and then Azure AD Domain Services actually takes advantage of that data, and it projects a new Active Directory forest that you can move these applications to and rejoin them to that forest. And now they get all the things they're used to. They get LDAP, they get NTLM, they get group policy, they get SIDs and tokens and things like that. And with that, now you have an application that's fully running in the cloud. It has no direct dependencies on on-premises resources, and it thinks it's a domain-joined application and gets all the things that come with that. Now, of course, there's more to this. There's a bunch of different limitations and places where this is continuing to evolve. But at a high level, it's an Active Directory forest fully running in Azure in the cloud that you can join machines to. And under the covers, it's actually using your Azure Active Directory tenant as the source of data for this new forest. So for the second half, now that we've talked a bunch about security capabilities in Azure AD, one place where there are just a whole bunch of new features, not just around security, but around usability and integration for developers and so forth, it's around ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. And in fact, as you look at this and you think about the move to the cloud and how much Microsoft's investing in their cloud strategy, ADFS is the key bridge for authentication between your on-premises directory and the cloud, and so it makes sense that Microsoft's spending a fair bit of resources here evolving ADFS. So keeping with the theme so far, we'll start with security and then we'll talk about some other things. We talked about how passwords are an issue, and while Windows Hello for Business was one option when you look at your workstation or your laptop, think about the extranet scenario where you're accessing Azure AD or another application that's federated with ADFS, and you're coming from outside the network. You might be coming from a personal device, you might be coming from an iOS device, an iPad or an iPhone or an Android or something like that. And so, of course, for some organizations, they use things like smart cards to get around this password risk. And smart cards are great. They use certificates. And if you're coming from a laptop with a smart card reader or with a virtual smart card, that's no problem at all. But when you're coming from, let's say, an iPad, for example, suddenly that smart card isn't so useful. So In Windows Server 2016, there's a whole bunch of different options that ADFS presents where you can still log in, potentially with a high level of assurance, but not use your password. The first one is around Microsoft's Azure Multi-Factor Authentication service. We'll talk about this in more detail on the next slide, but specifically, it's being able to use your phone as your primary logon credential. So that's pretty interesting. We talked about Windows Hello for Business. When you sign in with Windows Hello for Business, you're on a Windows 10 device and you go to the ADFS on Windows Server 2016. There's some special controls that are hooked into the browser that enables your machine to use that Windows Hello for Business credential and get a special type of token from ADFS called a PRT, or a primary refresh token. At a high level, you can think of that PRT as ADFS speak for what's a TGT, a Kerberos ticket granting ticket, in traditional on-premises AD. For managing your mobile devices, so you have your iOS devices, your Android devices enrolled, and they're considered compliant. And by virtue of the Intune compliance policies you define, a lot of people are like, I've been through two-factor authentication, I've enrolled my device, and it meets all the health checks, it's compliant. Why do I have to re-enter my username and password when I'm holding a device that I know whose that device is, and I know that it's healthy and it meets our policies? So with device authentication, if you have that compliant Intune enrolled mobile device, an iOS or Android device, you can actually configure an application to say possession of that device is actually enough to sign in without a username and password. And you can do the same thing if you have domain joined devices or Azure AD joined devices, and you have the right controls set up in ADFS and the right settings enabled in group policy to do this join. Traditional Windows devices that are joined can do this as well. And then the last piece is specifically around Azure Active Directory is being able to do certificate-based authentication to Azure AD services, which then gets pushed back to ADFS. And for example, if you issue certificates to mobile devices, be able to use those certificates on the mobile devices to authenticate to Azure AD, Office 365, and other ADFS protected services. Those capabilities are there. But above all four of these options, they all add up to the ability to sign in to corporate resources, to enterprise resources, potentially from the extranet without using a password. So there's a lot of security advantages here to using these. To talk about the Azure MFA option in a little bit more detail, if you've done Azure MFA before, multi-factor authentication with ADFS, you've probably had to go through the process of deploying the on-premises MFA server. To get this done highly available and to get it done correctly, there's actually a fair number of servers and a fair bit of work involved. With Windows Server 2016 ADFS, you can still do that if you want, but out of the box, there's also a built-in capability to go to Azure MFA in the cloud without that on-premises MFA server. And if you do this, and you want to use Azure MFA as the user's primary authentication, they can enroll their mobile device via the screens that are in Azure Active Directory. And then next time they go to sign in to ADFS, they can enter their username, and they can enter a one-time passcode that's presented in that Microsoft Authenticator app that they used to enroll in the first place. And you can see on the right side, there's a whole bunch of different options. Those are all the options that we just talked about on the previous slide. And you can define different authentication capabilities, whether you're coming from the outside, the extranet in this screen, or you're coming from on the network, the intranet in this case. So a lot of different choices there, and they all add up to that being able to choose whether I'm going to use a password or whether I'm going to use something that's perhaps a little bit more secure. As people have started working from outside the corporate network, from their personal devices and so forth, be able to grant conditional access and make decisions about what resources a user has access to, depending on things like who they are, what groups they're in, how they logged in, what level of assurance do we have about the user? Do they use one factor of authentication, or perhaps did they use two-factor authentication? Plus things about the device they're coming from. Is it enrolled with an MDM solution like Intune? Is it compliant? Am I on the network? Am I off the network? And of course, what application am I going to? Adding all these factors together is conditional access. And if you use Azure Active Directory today, Azure Active Directory Premium specifically, there's some really rich conditional access capabilities there. But then there's also the ability with ADFS, and especially ADFS and Windows Server 2016, to do conditional access decisions on premises, or to combine both of those together and make decisions in two places, taking all the data you have and meshing that together. So you take all these different factors, and with Windows Server 2016, you get to provide what are called access control policies that define on a per application basis or even globally who can access what, from where, and how. If you did this in previous versions of Windows Server, especially Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2012 with ADFS, you could get most of this done. There's some new capabilities here, but you could get the bulk of it done. But you had to write these really complicated claims rules that were in this language that was developed just for ADFS. And getting those right and testing them and debugging them and so forth, it was no easy task. And so to help with this, in Windows Server 2016, you can see on the right, now you can build these policies with a really handy screen that lets you define all the different rules and not have to worry about all that claims rule language. And even more so, if there's just something really basic you need to do, there's about 10 canned policies on the bottom there. They're already ready to go, so you don't even have to figure out the slightly more complicated rule screen that's on the right. So it's being able to define conditional access, being able to define it quickly and flexibly based on all these different attributes we've talked about the users, the devices, where they're coming from, and so forth. Another thing that's always really important to people is being able to brand the experience, making it their organizations, taking the Microsoft logo off, making it look like theirs. And you could do that in ADFS before, but what you couldn't do is have a different experience depending on which relying party, which federated application you're going to. And so with ADFS and Windows Server 2016, all the different elements that are circled or boxed, as the case may be, in red on this screen, you can brand every single one of those. And not only can you brand it, but you can brand it on a per application basis. So in this case, I'm signing into Azure AD and Office 365. I can change the title of the page to say sign into Office 365. But if I was also federating with, let's say, Concur for expenses, I could change this screen to have information about signing into Concur and how to get to the expense application, and maybe even have different support links at the bottom of the screen. So you can do this per application. It's something that people often ask for, and it's right there out of the box now. Of course, now we've talked about a bunch of great features, and you're thinking if you've done an ADFS upgrade before from 2012 to 2012 R2, for example, or even an older version, you had to build an entire new infrastructure side by side, test all your changes, and so forth, and then roll all those applications over for either to a new URL on a one-by-one basis, which in a large deployment is a massive undertaking, or swing everything over at once and hope for the best. Active Directory Domain Services has always supported this, where you could add new domain controllers, and then once you've gotten rid of all the old domain controllers, you could raise the functional level, and you would get the new features. The good news is with ADFS and Windows Server 2016, now you can do that too. If you have Windows Server 2012 R2 Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS, you can add your 2016 nodes to that ADFS farm. You can use the load balancer to distribute load and gradually wean off the 2012 R2 nodes. When you remove those 2012 R2 nodes from the farm, there's this new thing called a farm level in ADFS. You can upgrade that farm level to Windows Server 2016, and now the new capabilities that are there are unlocked and ready for you to use. So no more building an entire ADFS environment side by side and then managing a complex migration. If you have another directory, not all your users are in Active Directory, perhaps they're in another LDAP directory. With ADFS now, you can use LDAP directories other than AD Domain Services, to do that authentication. Anything that's LDAP v3 compliant can be the authentication source for some or all of your ADFS users, which is really handy. And if you're working with Azure Active Directory, with Azure AD Connect, the tool that's used to synchronize your on-premises directory to Azure AD, there's a feature in preview now that lets you synchronize that same LDAP directory to Azure AD. This is a bit of a very vertical specific capability, but if you work in higher education or a government or research situation, you might have to use something like INCOM. The technical term for them is SAML Confederations, but to step back a bit from the big words, the capability here is that you might have a whole consortium of different organizations that you really want to federate with one point, but have federated access to all those different organizations. In higher education, the consortium is called InCommon. And to do that, ADFS used to not really support this really well because the SAML metadata, this giant XML file that kind of describes everything that you're federating with, had multiple entities in it, and ADFS didn't know what to do when there was more than one entity in the metadata. So that's changed. Now there's direct support for this, and that capability is there if you happen to need it. In terms of some other just kind of useful odds and ends, if you will, enhancements that happen to ADFS, around security again, it used to be you had to be a domain admin to install ADFS unless you went through a whole lot of steps. That's not necessarily the case anymore. And along the same lines, being a local admin on the server is no longer necessary to manage ADFS, and vice versa. ADFS doesn't need you to be in local admins, so you can separate managing the underlying OS from managing the ADFS service itself. If you've ever looked at the auditing that happens when someone logs into ADFS, it generates dozens, if not close to 100 audits per event, which makes consuming that data really, really difficult to use. That's been simplified. Now it's an audit or two. You can collect that data and you can pull it into your SIEM tool or whatever you're using to collect that data and make a lot more sense of it. Another thing, if you need to migrate ADFS to a new environment or maybe to a development and test environment, there's this thing called the ADFS Rapid Restore tool. In a matter of minutes, you can take your entire ADFS configuration and then rehydrate it in a brand new installation. So all the manual steps of doing that migration have been removed. And also, if you're a developer, there's a whole bunch of new protocols and protocol flows that are supported to connect other types of applications and scenarios around things like OAuth, certain new flows that are there, OpenID Connect, and so forth. And just to wrap up, we talked about security and we just kept talking about security. That's really one of the two key areas I think you'll see investment, certainly for the on-premises Active Directory ecosystem. Security, and then what does it take to bridge the gap between your on-premises identity world and the cloud. Getting that hybrid identity in place and security, these are the two places that Microsoft's spending the most around AD. AD Domain Services is mature, it's stable, it's been around for a really long time. So instead of really core new features, I think you'll continue to see this iteration around security and hybrid identity. And of course, things like ADFS, AD Active Directory Federation Services, that's a key bridge to the cloud, are going to be integral to Microsoft's strategy around AD as we move forward. So with that, I'll be around to take questions that have been entered